So let us maybe, without further ado, since we are a little bit behind on schedule, move over to the second part of this morning's session, and it is our panel that will tackle on the one hand the concept of secondary sanctions, but also the impact they cause on finance, trade, as well as their humanitarian impact. And to that end, I'm grateful for our panel chair to step in, and I gladly pass the baton to Dr. Machiko Kanetake. Machiko Kanetake is an assistant professor at Utrecht University, also co-editor of the, or editor of the prestigious Leiden Journal of International Law. Machiko, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Sam, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Well, I very much appreciate that the keynote speaker of the conference has already set up some of the major challenges in this field of law and practice. And I'm sure we will touch upon those challenges during the panel discussions as well as the rest of the conference. So my name is Machiko Kanetake. I'm Associate Professor of Public International Law at Utrecht University. So building on the keynote speech, in the first panel, we will explore the concept of secondary sanctions as well as their economic and humanitarian implications. And to understand the concept and impact will serve, hopefully, as a basis for subsequent panels during this important conference. We are very delighted to have 4 experts today with us. Some of us are online. I think at least one of the speakers is on campus. So we will start with Professor Beaucillon for her presentation, and this will be followed by a brief Q&A. And we will have 2 more presentations together, and their presentations will be followed by Q&A. And this will leave, and then we will give the floor or screen to the final presenter. And just like the keynote speech, if you have any questions, you are welcome to raise them via chat, and we will try to address them during the Q&A. So with this short introductory note, I would like to give the floor to Professor Charlotte Beaucillon. She's a professor of international and European Union law at University of Lille. And among many publications, she published recently the important research handbook on unilateral and extraterritorial sanctions. So Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I tried to share my screen, so I hope you see the slides and myself as well. I would like to thank very much the organizers of the conference, and I'm sorry to contribute remotely. I'm very grateful for all the efforts that have been engaged in the organization, and I'm thrilled to participate this morning with a very interesting topic. Secondary sanctions, what's in the name? And I have to say that it's rather refreshing for someone like me who's been working on sanctions for something like 15 years. And I had a lot of pleasure preparing this. So this picture is actually taken from the Financial Times. It has been published in 2020, and it represents EU operators in the middle of the US and EU crossfire of sanctions. And I thought it was very representative of our problems, legal problems today. I will start with a short but thorough presentation of core concepts of my discussion, and I will then turn to a doctrinal divide that I identified when preparing this discussion. I will present it, and I will try to unwrap its underlying stakes, because I think it's very important for the following discussions today and tomorrow. And I then very shortly wrap up on the drawbacks of the current very blurry state of affairs for the emergence of an effective legal answer to the issue of secondary sanctions. So let's start first with this core concepts part. I would like to start with the very simple definition of international sanctions. I think we will all agree to say that international sanctions are international policy tools that are aimed at compelling their targets to change behavior. What I want to stress here is clearly that sanctions are not neutral, they are politically oriented, and this is their very purpose being so, even when they are multilateral. Now, I would like to present what I call here the reach dilemma. And this is closely linked to the division between multilateral sanctions and unilateral sanctions. Here again, I'm very well aware that we're not talking about UN sanctions today, but I need this contradiction and this distinction to ground my discussion. So when we talk about multilateral sanctions, I talk about UN sanctions adopted by the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter in the context of the maintenance of international peace and security. Why am I stressing this? Because there are decisions under the UN Charter which are binding on all UN member states. So there is an obligation to implement these sanctions throughout the jurisdictions of the 193 states of the United Nations. So theoretically, and I insist on this theory part, theoretically, multilateral sanctions can achieve much more than unilateral sanctions which are in contradiction, limited by the single jurisdiction of the state or group of states that are implementing and adopting unilateral sanctions. So in contradistinction with multilateral sanctions, unilateral sanctions should be, in theory, weaker in nature because of this reach dilemma. So what can we do in legal technique to fix this reach dilemma? Well, we have various legal techniques aimed at overcoming the limits of state jurisdiction. So please don't misunderstand this presentation. I'm very much attached to the theory of state jurisdiction. Nevertheless, we have lawful or unlawful techniques to overcome these limits. So let's start with a very simple definition of primary sanctions. Measures prohibiting persons and entities under states A jurisdiction with a territorial or personal nexus from entering a certain type of activity with state B. So this is the definition that has been referred to by Tom and Mr. Gussetti in their presentations. So when we look at this, the two techniques, dominating techniques to extend the reach of these unilateral primary sanctions are either voluntary adhesion or alignment, which is lawful because it's voluntary, and this is a feature that is a key in EU practice, or extensive extraterritoriality, which has already been qualified today unlawful when it comes to the controversial US nexus, extending the territory or the personality linked with the state. And here I have selected two examples. So in the US practice, we have, of course, the extension of the territorial link with the dollar-denominated transactions, but we also have very refined mechanisms, such as the one that we find in the Title III of the Helms-Burton Statute of 1996, which is based on the effect theory, so the effects of what an alleged trafficking in US goods would have on the US territory. When it comes to the notion of personal link with the US has developed since many years an extensive version of what is a person under US jurisdiction, and this dates back the 1980s with the Euro-Siberian pipeline case, and it is still the case with the Venezuela Act of 2014. So usually in the US practice, you have a mix of both this nexus with the predominance today of the territorial extensive nexus. So once we've said this, let's turn to secondary sanctions. So these would be measures from state A prohibiting foreign persons and entities, which are therefore not under its jurisdiction, from entering a certain type of activity with state B. So this also corresponds strongly with the definitions that have been given before. So I would like now to take my favorite example, which is Executive Order 13902, Iran sanctions, adopted in January 2020, which prohibits banking institutions, foreign banking institutions, from engaging in what is called in the executive order a significant transaction concerning significant goods or services used in connection with some sectors of the Iranian economy: construction, mining, manufacturing, or textile. So this is very interesting because the secondary sanction at stake in this in this executive order is precisely the exclusion from the US market through the prohibition to have a corresponding bank account in the US. So this is the threat of exclusion. But actually, the US executive can choose from a menu of much coercive measures, including deciding to list one entity on the specially designated persons list, which is actually now a primary sanction. So you have your name as a foreign company listed on a list of persons with whom US persons or persons under US jurisdiction are fully prohibited to deal with. So this is the shift from secondary sanctions to primary sanctions technique. And from this perspective, I have a very recent example of a Chinese tech company, the CEIEC, who has been listed in January 2021 because it provided services to the Venezuelan regime, and it has been considered as associated with the regime and therefore ended on this sanctions list. So well, this technique is very interesting because it's difficult to interpret exactly what is expected from the foreign operators. The significant transaction is particularly telling, and this has triggered problems of over-compliance and de-risking strategies by companies which had regrettable consequences, especially in the context of the COVID crisis. I'm sure we will talk about it later, with reports that some companies or some states under jurisdictions had, under sanctions, had difficulties to access medical countermeasures because of the prudence of other economic operators. This also clearly triggers a need of legal protection from legislative acts, but also through litigation. And I can only refer to the very clear presentation and keynote by Lucio Cusetti on the EU action in the field. Let's now turn to what I called the doctrinal divide within this definitional exercise, because when I was looking for definitions of secondary sanctions, I identified at least two different definitions of what are secondary sanctions used in doctrine, but also in practice and by public authorities. And I wanted to stress or to propose my hypothesis on what the underlying stakes of this definitional divide are, and to discuss them with you. So here is what I have called the definitional schism between these two definitions. So please focus with me on the upper side of the slide, where I took back my two definitions: primary sanctions as measures prohibiting persons and entities under states' aid jurisdiction. And now we will clearly focus on unlawful or controversial jurisdiction based on an extensive territorial or personal nexus. So once we've said that these are considered unlawful, then you should tell me, well, these are now equivalent to the stricter definition of secondary sanctions, meaning measures from state A prohibiting foreign persons from entering a certain activities, although they are not under its jurisdiction. So here we see that there is a kind of conceptual communication between primary sanctions techniques and secondary sanctions techniques. And this leads me to the lower part of the slide with the analysis of the uses and the stakes behind these two kinds of definitions. So on the broad definition side of secondary sanctions, we clearly see that it is objective oriented. So the focus is to denounce the will to curb a third entity, a state, a private operator, will. So the focus is here on changing a third entity's behavior. From what I found, it's mainly used in EU practice or non-US dominated practice. And I will go back to this a bit later. And what is underlying here is clear. It's about sovereign state equality or EU autonomous strategic autonomy, sorry, to take the latest wording, and clearly economic coercion in the end. From the perspective of the narrow definition of secondary sanctions, we have an activity-oriented definition. When you look at the tech company, the Chinese tech company example, you see that it ended on a SDN list because it was considered assisting, sponsoring, or supporting the Maduro's regime. So the focus is on the regulation of the activity at stake. It's a US dominated definition, clearly, and the focus is here on strategy and the power to influence international political and economic relations. So now I tried to check this hypothesis against political science works that have been published on secondary sanctions. And here is the first reference I wanted to make. So this graph is from the Center for a New American Security, which is a US think tank. Last report, Sanctions by the Numbers, this year, this spring. Here, what is interesting, in my opinion, is that there is a focus on the sanctions regime. So there is a focus on the global crisis on which the US wants to be decisive with its national agenda. So it's Iran, North Korea, Russia, Hezbollah, and then China, because of clearly the evolution of the sanctions against China with the Hong Kong crisis. Same source, but a very interesting graph with data focusing on SDN inscriptions by nationality. And here we see that most persons and entities that have been listed on these SDN lists are from China. So this invites us to understand the use of secondary sanctions as a tool, not only to regulate a specific global crisis, but a tool to position an economic power against another economic power in a more global policy perspective. What we do not see in these graphs is actually what I find very interesting also. What we do not see are the effects of these sanctions on economic operators. So in this perspective, the effects on economic operators are side effects or collateral damages, to take another kind of vocabulary, and it's rather insignificant, or at least there is no focus on this. Whereas when you take studies that are based on the broad definition of secondary sanctions, actually these studies focus on the economic impact for the EU operators. So this is taken from a study from a SPS Russian academic who wanted to highlight in 2019 the weight of secondary sanctions, the economic weight of secondary sanctions on EU operators. And you see on this graph a very high right left-hand corner and in the middle that the proportion of the fines on US businesses and European businesses has nothing to do. So majority of fines have been pronounced against EU businesses. So once this has been said, and I know, dear Chair, that the 15 minutes are now over, I just wanted to stress that because of their variety, secondary sanctions refer to at least two legal techniques on which they are based: unlawful primary sanctions and, strictly speaking, secondary sanctions. And therefore, this requires a tailored legal analysis grounding ad hoc reactions and solutions based on protean legal toolbox that we discussed earlier. So there is a need, and this is my conclusion, for legal tailoring from both perspectives of private practice and public practice to find the right tools to answer the right legal challenge at the right moment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte, for a very clear presentation, as well as the combination of the use of graphical images that really help us understand where the focus lies. So thank you so much for that. And I'm sure some of the questions sort of interlink between the definition and jurisdiction part will also come back to the subsequent panel. So I would like to invite participants online as well as on campus to ask a few questions. So I'd like to collect some questions addressed to Charlotte. I don't see anything in the chat. I would also like to invite other panelists to raise some questions to Charlotte. I'm sure there will be a lot of overlap in terms of the content as well as perspectives. Lucas?
Yes, hello there. Bonjour, Madame la Professeure. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Lucas Kleinert. I am a PhD student at the University of Hamburg, but I studied for some time in Lille, so very happy to see you. I have a question coming back to one of your initial slides referring to overcoming the limits of state jurisdiction. Certainly this is a topic which will rather be broached in the second panel, but I wanted to ask you, do you see other possibilities in overcoming the limits of state jurisdiction? As well, my understanding is from the Lotus judgment, that is to say, well, one is convention, of course, and then in coutume, there's also le droit de contre-mesure, also the law of countermeasures. And if you could elaborate on that, that would be interesting to me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lucas. Perhaps Charlotte would like to respond immediately.
Actually, yes, it's an interesting question, but I think the two questions do not belong to the same stage of legal analysis. When you look at the theory of state jurisdiction, the question is to know to what extent a state can regulate a specific activity. And there are criteria like the territory or the nationality of the person that are clearly the classical links to a state-specific action, whereas countermeasures are tools that intervene later in the picture when perhaps there is an allegation that a specific state action is unlawful and that the state that is affected by this unlawfulness wants to react. So this is how I would articulate the two questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charlotte. I was wondering if there would be some questions from the campus side. Tom, I would imagine as an online chair.
Yes, we have someone with a question. We'll try the other microphone again, hoping that it will. Okay, no echo. Yes.
Good morning.
I'm not sure I hear the question.
Tom, I don't think we could hear the questions.
The question is coming up.
Perfect.
Hello, good morning. I think, can you hear me now?
Yes,
I'm Dr. Roberto Isarsina from the European Commission Legal Service, RELEX team. I have a question concerning your definition of primary sanctions. While defining primary sanctions, you refer to the EU system of sanctions being a system based on voluntary adhesion, but Council regulations are binding on member states. So I would kindly ask you to maybe clarify your analysis and elaborate on that. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course. We're not talking about the same thing. Clearly, the regulation are binding on EU member states by virtue of the Treaty on the European Union. I was talking about the extension of the implementation of EU sanctions outside the EU territory. So here I refer to data from foreign national legislations that clearly envisage the possibility for national foreign authorities to get inspired by EU sanctions, as well as by US sanctions, by the way. So this is a rather informal way of including EU sanctions within a third country's national legislation. And there are also more formal ways, and I'm specifically thinking of agreements that the EU has been engaging with the organizations with which it has a specific relationship when it comes to funding and using of EU funds, conditioning the use of EU funds by the funded organization to the respect of EU sanctions.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte. And on the definition part, there is also a comment from Anthonios. And now I'd like to give the floor to Tom.
Yes, if I may, one question, Charlotte, you presented the two views on the concept of secondary sanction, I think in a very clear, transparent manner. The related question is it important that, for instance, as legal scholars, that we have an overarching, commonly accepted definition? Do you think that there ought to be a single accepted definition? Would that help the debate? Any views on that?
Thank you very much.
Which would be the proper one, of course?
Well, you tell me, because you're the author, the co-author of major works on this. And actually, I know that you work on the basis of the broad definition, and this is exemplified by the very program of the conference. I think it's useful to have a global definition. Because it stresses the focus, and the focus is economic coercion and reaction to economic coercion. However, I think it makes it perhaps more complicated in day-to-day legal practice to disentangle what is at stake. So I can take two examples. When you are facing Helms-Burton Title III litigation in the US, this is about the effects on the US territory, and this is about the link with the jurisdiction of the state. So this is a very much narrow legal problem than, for instance, and a very different actually legal problem than the one of a bank being excluded from the US financial markets. So I think this calls for a distinguished legal qualification when it comes to the very specific legal questions, because this rests on different mechanisms. It's the same thing when we look at what is underpinning the theory or the American way of framing secondary sanctions that I could not develop in the presentation for obvious time reasons. It is often said that secondary sanctions are based on a threat of exclusion and therefore rest on a choice by the economic operator. So you choose to either work with the US or work with your foreign business partner. So is it really a choice? And if we, perhaps in some cases it is. So this is the problem that Lucio Cussetti pointed to when it comes to concealing activities and over-compliance. But when it comes to other kind of what we call secondary sanctions, like unlawful primary sanctions, it can lead to litigation, which is not foreseen in stricto sensu secondary sanctions. And I think of course, BNP case, JP Morgan case, and Huawei case. So these are not the same legal stakes. So in the very refined legal analysis, having a too broad understanding of what is a legal secondary sanction may be tricky.
Thanks a lot, Charlotte. I'm sure Tom will have some follow-up questions, but I'd like to now invite, like to move on to the second speaker. And thank you so much, Charlotte. I think your presentation clearly highlights the fact that the question of definition is also tied up to our understanding about objectives of secondary sanctions. So I'm sure these two issues will come back during the rest of the panel as well as the conference. So thank you so much. So now I'd like to give the screen to Professor Christopher Hartwell. He is also online, thank you. Right, so Professor Hartwell is directing at the moment the International Management Institute at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, a School of Management and Law, and he's also a professor of international management at Kosmicki University in Poland. So Christopher, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers, obviously, for having me. I wish I were in Ghent right now, but Switzerland has its own form of secondary sanctions on anyone returning from Belgium, which would have necessitated a lot of quarantine for me, which can't be done this time of year. I'd like to thank Charlotte for an excellent presentation, especially one that I'm going to flesh out a little bit more in terms of the economic side, in terms of the economic impact. And I will say right off the bat that I'm not a lawyer. I study law from an economic perspective. I am an economist. I work at a business school. So a lot of the legal nuances will be lost probably on me, but doesn't matter because that's not what I'm here to teach. That's not what I'm here to lecture on. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about kind of what happens after the law gets into effect. Now we know, we've had a great keynote. We had a great presentation from Charlotte on kind of understanding what secondary sanctions are. When we think about them in terms of their use, they're an old approach, but one that's found kind of new favor as an economic and political weapon. And yes, I am in fact an American, you can tell by my accent, so I will be speaking mostly about America at this point. They have this extraterritorial dimension. They're potentially suspect under international law, as Tom wrote in 2020. They've been in use by the United States since at least 1964, 1965, if not beyond. They are explicitly designed to have an economic and especially a trade effect. Now, the purpose of the secondary sanction is to tighten the noose economically on a sanctioned country. And it's often used in tandem with primary sanctions to kind of extend the cordon out further, what we were just kind of talking about. How can we influence others to do our bidding? But despite this reality and the fact that there is obviously a lot of legal work that's going on here, there's very little economic research on the effects on secondary sanctions, what they have on the target and both on the target and on third countries. Do secondary sanctions actually work? Do they act as an effective supplement to primary sanctions for success? And then how do these secondary sanctions affect the third countries? So what I'm going to do today is kind of survey the theory and the evidence that we have on secondary sanctions to understand just what effects they have. It's based on a paper that I and many other people from Case Warsaw, which I used to be the president of, CEPS and a few other places did for the European Union in 2020. It was driven by worries about kind of the Nord Stream 2 and what happens if the US once again reaches into its extraterritorial bag and pulls out sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Now, in terms of kind of the spoiler alert, the results from economics are murky because we know that we've got this huge literature that says primary sanctions work in quotes. It depends on what you mean by work, and we'll get to that. But it appears that extraterritorial or secondary sanctions don't appear to have any additional impact on trade flows. They don't work more. They do, however, have a massive impact at the microeconomic level. And it's not just about fines, it's about shifting incentives. They generate winners and losers from trade, which trade already, as we know, generates winners and losers. It shifts the distribution of winners and losers at the firm level, especially for firms that have no dealings with the sanctioning agent. So we know that economic sanctions work. They go after a national economy. They deny anyone associated with the country the right to trade with the sanctioned agent. So they work in terms of their effect on trade. They have an immediate negative impact on the sanctioned country. I mean, the channels in which these work are diverse, and Gary Clyde Huffbauer, I think he's still at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, has kind of updated his work every year. 2008 is kind of the main site on this. But if we look at kind of comprehensive sanctions from the US, they estimate that Gary Huffbauer estimates that they reduce bilateral trade flows between the US and the target by up to 73%, but it increases trade between the European Union and Japan, or Japan and the target. So the channel it's working through is that it's this distributional effect, it's trade diversion. It's the things that we cry against as economists when we're thinking about trade theories. This is trade creation, is this trade diversion? Well, this is trade diversion. Taken from our 2020 paper, we did some kind of primary modeling based on work that Gabriel Feldmayer did in 2020. We looked at 726 sanction episodes from around the world from 1950 to 2016. And what we got was that, look at that, it works. Trade sanction effect on exports to the left, you see there's a huge drop in a sanctioned country's exports in the first 6 or 7 years. Then you get better at running the blockade, and then you kind of ratchet up the sanctions again. Same thing happens when it comes to imports. Imports drop precipitously, they come back a little bit, but they never get back to where they were. So economic sanctions work. We actually did a lot of work in this paper at kind of saying, well, how do they work? Again, what channels do they work through? And it depends on the instrument and what is being sought after. Successful sanctions, either by the object of increasing democracy, of destabilizing the regime, etc., all these things that you can kind of see at the top. Trade sanctions, what we're focusing on here. Financial sanctions will come in the next presentation, which I'm looking forward to. You see, trade sanctions work maybe about a little more than half of the time for halting territorial conflict, but otherwise it gets less than a 50% chance. Flip a coin, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. And it's very crap. You can see that at fostering democracy, trade sanctions don't really work for that. That takes us then to secondary sanctions. So these are all primary sanctions. So how would they matter? Now, we know the spillover effects of primary sanctions can go beyond, and in some cases far beyond, their target. Secondary sanctions have the potential to disrupt countries other than the target, and or those who trade directly with the targeted country. In fact, this isn't a flaw of a secondary sanction. This is precisely the effect. This spillover effect is an objective rather than a byproduct. Now, in reality, it's ostensibly done to influence the sanctioned country, influence its behavior. But in reality, it's targeted at third parties who may be doing business with the sanctioned country. So two things I've heard already today are perfect. Tom's chaos at bargain rates, perfect way to put it. And then listening to Charlotte's presentation, I was thinking when she made the distinction between unilateralism and multilateralism, secondary sanctions are forced multilateralism. You will all get on board with us while we are going to sanction someone else. So this chaos, this desire to disrupt, is there, it's built into secondary sanctions. And the effects that we should see from economic perspective is trade. You're closing off additional avenues to trade, which may have circumvented standard sanctions by third parties. You think of sanctions on Russia since 2014, their invasion of Ukraine, their annexation of Crimea. What do you see? You see this huge increase in shrimp, prawn coming from Belarus. Belarus is a landlocked country. Belarus does not have prawn. It doesn't have shrimp. It's re-importing from elsewhere. So the trade is circumventing. So if you have secondary sanctions, maybe you can stop the prawns going from Belarus to Russia. Second thing, supply chains. If you can yank a sanctioned country out of a global supply chain, you can hasten their economic collapse. They can't get the things they need to run their machines. They can't get the bullets that they need to repress their own people. All of these special things then might bring them to the bargaining table. It's a way to ratchet up the pressure. And finally, you can cut kind of sanctioned countries off from additional supplies of finance, again, which we'll hear about in the next presentation. But the secondary sanctions, in addition to these intended effects, also have these secondary effects. First off, much like central banks conducting monetary policy, policymakers, and I can say this, I used to work at the US Treasury Department, we don't care what the secondary sanctions do to other countries. That's not in our job description. It doesn't say worry about what happens to Hungary and other European member states. We don't care. So we only have a policy goal. Here's a blunt instrument. Of course, these other countries then have to make a decision. Allied countries, allied with the United States, which want to preserve this kind of political unity, will see their own economic disruption. Their trade patterns are going to shift if they adhere to the sanctions. But it also generates increased uncertainty. What happens if the government comes in that doesn't agree with the US line, et cetera, and then investment shifts? What if you don't care what the US says? Well, if you don't want to preserve this political unity, you see costs going against the United States. You have legal challenges, you have political political discussions at high levels and say we're not going to do this, or you do something like blocking regulations, and you sour relations. An example of this kind of from game theory. So you have sanctions between trading partner X and country Y. This third country, country Z. Country Z trades extensively with countries X and Y. Well, then it has to choose which one it prefers. If it prefers Y, it loses businesses with X. If it prefers X, then it's prevented from business with country Y. In either case, there's a welfare loss. Again, kind of econ 1. On the other hand, there could be some benefits. If country Z trades extensively with country Y, but not at all with country X, it could benefit from new opportunities from the withdrawal of country X firms from country Y. Think of this the other way around. If country Z trades extensively with country X and not at all with country Y, well, then it continues to trade with country X, even if country X is sanctioning country Y. And it might also benefit from sanctions as country Y firms are no longer in the picture. So you can benefit somewhat if you are sitting on the sidelines of these secondary sanctions. But life is micro. We look at things in macro, but countries don't trade, firms trade, people trade. So this macro look really obscures the reality that sanctions have substantial microeconomic effects. It's not just fines like the Timofeyev slide, which Charlotte showed us. First off, firms who do not deal with the sanctioning country, in this case the US, but do have dealings with the sanctioned countries, for example, Iran, are likely to benefit, while firms with ties to both will be harmed. And this is independent of country level responses. This is a specific firm. What the sanction does, it acts as this kind of competition killing distortion, which then lowers kind of overall welfare because it lowers consumer surplus, but increases producer surplus for that specific firm. Why? Less competition, you could charge more. If you charge more, you are then indirectly harming the target country, which is what the US wants in the first place anyway. So you have helped kind of the US with its secondary sanctions, even as you were helping yourself. Secondly, firms get caught in the middle, trying to understand which set of laws to comply with. Blocking regulations, the picture from the Financial Times that Charlotte showed, caught in the middle. Finally, in individual firms, there might be disruptions in supply chains which involve the sanctioned country, like say Iran is producing petroleum equipment. Even if there's no direct trade between the two countries, things happening down the supply chain can then also harm a specific firm. At the same time, we know from the economics literature that primary sanctions have diminishing marginal returns. You get better at running the blockade. It's tougher to enforce it over time. Secondary sanctions should also have these diminishing marginal returns, and they should have them even bigger because it's tough to be the world's policeman. The US has tried it, it hasn't really worked. The severity of sanctions, if you increase the severity of sanctions, you reduce the probability of being able to effectively enforce them, even in a country with as much state capacity as the United States. The only way it works then is if the sanctioning country can convince other countries to become its deputy. The United States has been really good at things like this. Policing foreign bank accounts as an American abroad. I know that the IRS has somehow convinced many countries to go along with working as an arm of the Internal Revenue Service. I don't know why sovereign states would do that, but they do. To kind of quickly work through how this looked in reality. In Cuba, the United States has used Cuba as a testing ground for these kind of extraterritorial sanctions. Charlotte mentioned Helms-Burton. Before that, there was the Torricelli Act, which was an overt stretch of extraterritoriality, authorized the president to apply sanctions against any country that didn't cooperate and continues to trade with Cuba. There was a 180-day window before ships which docked in Cuba could enter US ports. We don't see a lot of macro effects out of this, but we do see firm level effects. Firms are abandoning ventures. Bayer, AG, Pharmacia was active in Cuba since 1970, but then found itself prohibited from supplying Cuba with medicine. And as I said about increasing costs, Cuba spent an extra estimated US $8.7 million on health equipment imported from the EU from 1993 to 1996, which it wouldn't have had to spend if there'd been more competition. Helms-Burton, the US doubles down. We threaten people from third countries that do business with Cuba. A 97 report for the European American Business Council surveyed 42 multinational companies and found that 61% had been adversely affected by the Cuban embargo. Treasury, where I used to work, OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, was extremely busy. They investigated 10,823 cases of violations from 2000 to 2006. They collected USD 8.1 million, which is an infinitesimally small amount when you think of both Treasury's budget, OFAC's budget, and the US government budget. Was it worth it? We've mentioned already Iran. The US also has a long history of extraterritoriality in Iran. The Iran and Libya Sanctions Act of 1996, which then became just kind of the Iran Sanctions Act in 2010, worked in the sense that it targeted oil and gas flows and was meant to kind of stop European firms from investing in oil and gas. But it only worked because A, the US executive branch gave out waivers by the bucketful. And secondly, because the EU actually moved closer to the US in terms of a policy of divestment from oil and gas sector, and it culminated in the decision to ban purchases of crude oil. Now, of course, we know we had JCPOA, and then we don't have JCPOA. Now we might have JCPOA again. It shows the danger of these kind of pendulum sanctions. And again, firms are confronted with this catch-22 situation. It may be illegal under EU law for firms to comply with US sanctions. What do? Whose master do you serve? So how can firms plan for such an eventuality other than shying away from Iran entirely, which again is the goal of the secondary sanction. So to conclude on kind of these economic effects, sanctions, primary sanctions have been well studied for their economic effects, but secondary sanctions have thus far resisted such scrutiny. We tend to look at things like fines. We don't look at all of the other economic channels that are happening underneath. Theoretically, though, I mean, this is a huge hole because we should approach secondary sanctions using the same tools as understanding primary sanctions, incentives, game theoretic approaches, public choice, trade modeling, all of these kind of standard tools in an economist toolkit. Cuba and Iran show that the effects are likely to fall more specifically on firms. Again, we live life microeconomically in terms of behavior and decisions. Which master do you serve? What regulations do you follow? How do you plan for the long term when things can change so quickly? And can we understand the effects that cannot be seen? What would have happened in the absence of specific secondary sanctions? What would the world look like? What would a firm look like in the absence of those sanctions? We need to do better modeling, kind of counterfactuals. We're not great at it, but we have some ideas on how to do it. And so more work is needed, frankly, on understanding these microeconomic effects, as well as the broader macroeconomic effects. I said at the beginning that this was based on a report we did for the European Union in 2020. The reason behind that original paper, Nord Stream 2 and possible sanctions, now no longer seems to be a problem because we have an American presidential administration which is eager to appease Russia. So it seems like sanctions are off, but whatever happens in the next couple of weeks with Russia and Ukraine, we'll see. But regardless, for this paper, going forward, we need to bring these economic tools to bear on the sequence of effects from secondary sanctions and whether or not they actually work. This can then help to inform better legislation, can inform better policy making, and then can kind of link these two separate but very, very similar and interlocked disciplines of the legal side and the economic side. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Christopher. Your presentation highlighted many layers of spillover effect, which are perhaps not just an incidental effect. So this really makes us wonder, what the objectives of the secondary sanctions are. And this is also tied up to Charlotte's presentation. So thank you so much for that.